Now, well, as many of you will know here today, this is the second year anniversary of the Bahrain's Arab Spring, which of course started in February 14th, 2011. It is the longest and probably the most peaceful revolution across the Arab world. And it culminated, I'm sure many of you remember the now iconic pictures of thousands of troops from Saudi Arabia crossing over the bridge into Bahrain. Some of those trucks and cars and armoured vehicles bought by Saudi Arabia from the British government. Human rights groups continue to document abuses in Bahrain. Both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have published extensive materials now which are available on their websites of human rights abuses that continue to go on in Bahrain. And indeed only today a 17-year-old boy was shot dead by police. Today, really, our discussion is, of course, about the continuing situation in Bahrain, but really more particularly a focus on the British government's role within Bahrain. But before we go on to the discussion, we're going to watch a short film. I haven't seen this short film, but we're going to watch this short film above us. And I think what we'll do then is watch the film, and then if that's okay, I'll introduce the speakers. They're each going to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes each. And then I'm going to open it up, because really it's about you and your questions. And also you may want to say things. I'm not going to be one of these people that say it has to be a question. I want your contribution, but what I am going to do is limit any contribution down to about 2 minutes. So if you see me cutting you down, it's because I just want to make sure that as many as you can speak, and also, of course, get responses from those upon the panel. So shall we start really by seeing this film, which I'm hoping we can switch on now. Has she just gone away? All right. Well then, until... Is she coming in now? Is it? It's him. She. It's okay.
This is the waterfront of Moharrak Island. It's a part of the collection of islands which make up the small territory of Bahrain. They produce quite a lot of oil, though not a tremendous amount compared with Middle East standards. But they do, in addition, have one of the largest oil refineries in the world. Bahrain has a treaty with us under which we guarantee to protect her from outside interference. And we have considerable influence in what goes on inside Bahrain. Up till now, our relations with the people here have always been very friendly. Yet on this very spot where I am now, the Foreign Secretary, Mr. Selwyn Lloyd, when he was here on a short visit on March the 2nd this year, suddenly found himself in the middle of a riot directed against him. That's because the people of Bahrain are demanding from the ruler that they should have more say in the running of their own affairs. What is it that the committee wants?
The committee wants reforms and wants to participate in the administration of the country.
Does it not participate in the affairs of Bahrain at all at the moment?
At all at the moment. People are not participating in their own affairs. It is only one-man rule.
Now, what is the system of justice in Bahrain?
We got no justice. We got no, we got no rules whatsoever. We haven't got a code. We haven't got a penal code either.
No law?
And no laws. That's what we are trying to get for this country.
Now, why do you want Sir Charles Belgrave to go?
Well, because he actually not an expert for administration, and he has been here for the last 32 years, and he did absolutely nothing to improve the country. And I think he's getting very, very old, because he's 61 now, and he has all the powers. He's administrating hospitals, police, customs, finance, justice. That can't be for one man.
Now, do you want British protection of Bahrain to continue in the future or not?
Providing the British government help the people and support them instead of only supporting the rulers, as they are doing now.
You think that the British government ought to back up some of your demands?
Exactly.
Now, it has been said that your movement is very much influenced by Egypt, and that that makes it very anti-British. What do you say to that?
That is not correct at all. We love Egypt certainly because we speak the same language, same religion, and our education comes from Egypt. We like Egypt very much, but our movement is not influenced by any outside power.
Now,
we don't want to have our demands in installments, as I should say. We want them as a whole thing.
do you mean that you won't agree to work anything unless Sir Charles Belgrave goes?
Well, we don't want anything to work actually unless we got the whole demands together,
Including
Sir Charles Belgrave to leave Bahrain.
Sir Charles Belgrave has been in Bahrain for 30 years. This is the garden of his house. Sir Charles, what exactly is the job that you do here?
I'm employed by the Sheikh as his advisor, and I'm the head of the Sheikh's government.
And what was the cause of the trouble which happened when the Foreign Secretary was here on March the 2nd?
That was an organised demonstration. It was anti-British, anti-Sheikh, and anti-me.
And what is the attitude of the government to the demands now being made by the committee?
Some of the demands are reasonable and are being acceded to. Some of the demands are not reasonable.
They put a pencil in my ear. They broke my nose twice. They broke my knee. With a hammer.
Is that the man that was in charge of that torture?
Yes. He is Colonel Ian Henderson.
Ian Henderson is a British national. For 30 years he was head of state security in Bahrain, a necklace of strategically placed islands in the Persian Gulf. His accusers say that under his leadership and personal example, state torture was commonplace, terror a working tool. Today, the security forces he commanded stand accused of murder, mutilation and the abuse of children. In a secret Foreign Office paper, the unidentified author, probably Parsons, writes,
"Over the past 3 years, Special Branch, under the command of the able Henderson, has established a dominating position over the subversive groups."
2 years later, Ian Henderson embarked on a series of arrests and detentions. Parsons wrote to a colleague,
The ruler's view is that the detention should not be allowed to become protracted, but that Henderson was quite right in carrying them out in the first place to give the NLF and anybody else a sharp lesson.
His accusers claim that Ian Henderson, the Scot once feted as a hero and presented to British royalty, was to continue giving sharp lessons to the people of Bahrain for the next 30 years. For over 20 years, Ian Henderson has had a home here at Holme on the southern edges of Dartmoor. Which begs a question. Why is it that the man also known as the Butcher of Bahrain has never been arrested, never questioned?
Where people fighting for democratic rights broke the barriers of fear, only to find themselves alone and crushed. This is their story, and Al Jazeera is their witness, the only TV journalists who remained to follow their journey of hope to the carnage that followed. This is the Arab Revolution that was abandoned by the Arabs, forsaken by the West, and forgotten by the world. On March 14, 2011, Saudi Arabia led a military force of thousands into Bahrain, following weeks of street protests.
هذه الوقفة التي أبهجت وأفرحت جميع شعب مملكة البحرين.
Having fearfully watched the revolutions of Tunisia and Egypt, the Saudis would not allow one in their own backyard. In an unprecedented move, the GCC Peninsula Shield Force, a joint military of the 6 Gulf states, would be used to control citizens of the Gulf.
But let me be clear, we always stand up for human rights, and it's important that peaceful protests are allowed to go ahead. But I think we should be clear, Bahrain is not Syria. There is a process of reform underway, and this government backs that reform and wants to help promote that reform.
Excellent progress here in terms of implementing some of the things immediately, like the removal of arrest powers from the NSA, clearly crucial. The other issues will take time, and you cannot expect wholesale reform to take place in a matter of weeks. Some of this stuff, human rights training for 20,000 police officers is an immense undertaking.
I've spoken to people who have told me that they would take it. This has happened in the last couple of weeks. Yeah. Picked up, taken to unofficial sites or police areas that have not been officially recognized, I suppose, as police stations, beaten, tortured, they say. Yeah. And I can tell you the sites exactly. Yeah. Bahrain Youth Hostel, municipal buildings in Demistan, and the racing club and Bani Jamri. This is happening, they tell me now. So the present is, and these are issues about...
You're lobbying those things into me now, and if those things have happened, then there's a proper procedure where they need to, make their complaints. It'll be addressed and it will be investigated if that's the case. There's an awful lot, though, not doubting the veracity of what you just said, there's an awful lot of mischief on these social media sites.
وفي ذات السياق شدد جلالته على التزام مملكة البحرين بحكومتها على مواصلة الإصلاحات في المجالات القضائية والاجتماعية والاقتصادية للجميع ولجميع المواطنين مصانع. وأشار جلالته خلال المباحثات إلى الجهود التي بذلتها حكومة مملكة.
As this is the first inquiry, can I take the opportunity of just pointing something out to the wider public? There's been a considerable amount of press speculation that this is an inquiry into human rights in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. It is not. And I hope that those who wish to divert the committee's attention will understand that we intend to stick very firmly to our terms of reference.
Nevertheless, in the eyes of many Bahraini people, we are identified with the regime. We seem, in the interest of our oil and our policy east of Suez, to be anxious to preserve the status quo. The peculiarity of the Bahrain situation is that people want us to stay here, but they also want us to use our power to create a democracy. If we don't, then we will be even more deeply and perhaps tragically identified with an autocratic and increasingly unpopular ruling family.
Well, there you go. That will give you a bit of a taste of certainly Britain's involvement within Bahrain over the last 100 years or so. Can I introduce the speakers? On my far right, not literally in politics, I'm sure, is John Lubbock, thank you, who's from the Bahrain Centre for Human Rights. Next to him is Craig Murray, who was the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan and is now a human rights activist. Next to me is Farida Ghulam, who's a member of the board of the National Democratic Action Society, and her husband is currently, you should all have a leaflet actually on your chair. Her husband, Ibrahim Sharif, is currently been sentenced to 5 years, I think, in custody in Bahrain. On my left-hand side, Dr. Ala Shahabi, founding member of Bahrain Roch, and her husband was also arrested and put on trial and sentenced, I think in 2011 it was, wasn't it? It was. And on my left here is Mike Dibble, who was a professor of comparative literature at the University of Bahrain, and now is doing a lot of research by the sounds of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
At the moment. And what I'm going to do, if I may, is to start on the right-hand side and just work round and ask for, as I say, for a short talk, remembering, of course, the topic in hand for about 5 to 7 minutes. So I can start with you.
Hi. There's so much that you can say about Bahrain, although after working on human rights there for the last 2 years, you sort of get stuck in a bit of a Groundhog Day where you kind of looking at the Google alerts and it's just the same stuff every single day. I mean, I could talk about Bahrain Centre for Human Rights itself and the people who work for the organisation who are in jail. I could talk about my own experiences with how the Bahrain government uses PR companies to try to cow people into silence if they dare to speak out against some of the crimes that have been committed. But I think to give a sort of a grounding, I'm going to just do a sort of a general overview of how I feel about the situation after 2 years, and then I'll leave it up to some of the other people to talk about their experiences with the British government. If there's anything you can say about Bahrain after 2 years, it's that you have to kind of break the norm of the idea that a tyrannical and autocratic government can still survive in the modern world, because you often come up against people who will try and justify it in some way. But there are people all over the world who are fighting against autocratic and tyrannical governments, and it shouldn't be the norm. It shouldn't be something that we just accept. In the Maldives, where its first democratic elected president, Mohammed Nasheed, has just survived an attempt to arrest him by allies of the former dictator. In Sri Lanka, where the Bahrain, which like Bahrain has had an investigation into the conduct of its army in the civil war, the recommendations of which were ignored and abuses allowed to persist against Tamils and Muslims. In Mali, in Sudan, in Yemen, in Syria, in Saudi, in Iran, in West Papua, Tibet, Palestine, Kurdistan, the last four of these are places that don't even exist according to the international community of states. They don't even have a state identity or the rights that come with that. So, I just want to put Bahrain in that sort of world perspective. In contrast to some of those cases, Bahrain shouldn't be so much of a problem, as all Bahrainis want to be an independent sovereign country. And that means sovereignty from lots of countries that want to have influence over Bahrain, both Iran and Saudi, the US and the UK. And I suppose, if you were being unkind, you could say that was quite a political sort of a statement, but it's based in international law that a state should have self-determination. That's Article 1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which Bahrain has signed and ratified. The text also says that individuals should enjoy equal rights for men and women. That's Article 3, the right to life, Article 6, freedom from torture, Article 7, to be informed of the reason for arrest and be brought promptly before a judge, Article 9, liberty of movement and freedom to choose his residence, Article 12, to be considered equal before the law, Article 14, freedom of thought, conscience and religion, 18, freedom of expression, 19, freedom of assembly and association, 20 and 21. So you sort of ask yourself, how many of those laws do you imagine Bahrain has been breaking in the last 2 years? Pretty much all of the covenant, the International Bill of Rights that it signed. The rights that we have as human beings are political because power acts on us to do things to us or to make us do things that are not our choice. We've created rights as a political guarantee that we have to realize and that our states have to realize in order to protect us. So it may be political to say that Bahrain is in breach of many articles of international law that it has signed, but it's also the truth. When Bahraini government representatives say that it will take a long time to create democracy or that protesters are terrorists acting on the orders of a foreign power, these are excuses to detract from the basic point about Bahrain, that it is an autocratic regime where power is concentrated in the hands of a few people, which discriminates against a large proportion of its population and reacts repressively towards any criticism. It is a part of our humanity that we know what is right from what is wrong. If someone is oppressing and abusing me and I ask him to stop, is it acceptable for that person to say, well, I'd like to stop, but this behavior will take me a long time to change, and you can't expect Rome to be built in a day? There are no excuses for not stopping violations, and political prisoners could be free tomorrow if the regime decided so. Bahrain says it does not imprison people for offences solely related to their freedom of expression, yet just a couple of months ago 4 men were jailed for offending the king on Twitter. This attitude has to change. It's not compatible with a modern state, but it's so ingrained in pro-regime people that on Twitter sometimes people seem to believe that insulting the British monarch would also be published with a fine or a prison sentence were I to do so. But luckily, since I'm a Republican, I'm not only free to believe that the institution of the British monarchy is an anachronistic anti-meritocratic blot on our democratic copybook, but I'm also free to actually tell them to go and stick their Dutch original sausages where the sun don't shine, if I were to do so, if I were to choose to do so, which of course I'm not. So, is it nice? I'm not being arrested. It's absolutely pointless to try to stop anybody chanting Yaskut Hamid. And the more you try, the more you'll encourage people to do it. As we've seen from this film, the same situation has been ongoing in Bahrain since the 50s, if not the 20s. And so it's understandable that people are very, very frustrated. I'm frustrated. I've only been doing it for 2 years. So, in a democracy, you have the right to be offended because having your feelings hurt is not the same as being shot. Being involved in human rights does not mean you can't have political opinions, but it does mean that you can't get involved in the political system and try to influence the outcome of an election. Nobody working for human rights organisations is going to tell Bahrainis who to vote for. Unlike the Bahrain government, we believe they can decide for themselves what the best political system for Bahrain is. Like in other Arab states, it won't be perfect. It may require a system of power sharing between segments of the population, as in Lebanon, but if you go to Lebanon now, you can see it's a damn sight better than what it was like 20 years ago. Bahrain's system has not progressed since before independence. Sectarianism, violence, division, anger and conflict are all getting worse, so it is not just a case of be patient. The people will be patient if they can see the country is moving in the right direction, but the longer it drifts toward violence and anarchy, the less patience you will find from people. It's time to start the process of reform. It's time to let people decide for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Craig, as a former British ambassador, particularly working in a country like Uzbekistan, and the brave things that you did whilst there, standing up against the human rights abuses, can you bring really your own perspectives as to what really, from the British involvement in Bahrain, to what extent and in what direction is it heading? Are we withdrawing? Are we coming back? Are we getting more involved? I mean, what's your view?
I'll try and do that. I think what I can do best is to try to explain how I see it from a point of view of what the British government is doing, what the motives of the British government are, and what the mechanisms they use are. Actually, unless this is for a feed for television, I prefer not to use it. But I would just say that, no, it's certainly true now you can say rude things about the British royal family and not be arrested yet. But if you'd asked me a decade ago, I would have thought it impossible that you could be arrested for demonstrating outside Parliament. But if we decide now to walk down to Parliament to demonstrate against British policy in Bahrain, we will be arrested. And freedoms which we used to take for granted are disappearing. When I joined the Foreign Office in 1984, I would have thought it impossible that 20 years later I would be sacked for standing up for human rights, but I was. And sadly, I think the notion that Britain is a wonderful democracy is one you have to throw aside in your consideration of the British-Bahraini relationship. William Hague today made a speech on really the subject we are discussing. He made a speech today in which he said that Britain, in considering its relationship with regimes which are less than perfect, as he put it, has to be pragmatic, and that we cannot only deal with regimes which we like. And he went on to say that we, and I quote, he said, we have to deal with the world as it is, not with the world as we want it to be. Which is interesting, and would be interesting were it consistent. But when it comes to Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya or perhaps Syria, suddenly we have to change the world. When it comes to other countries like Bahrain or Uzbekistan, we have to maintain the status quo. And trying to discover any consistency in these stories is impossible. It plainly doesn't relate to democracy. And there's a huge amount of British support for the Bahraini despotism, which is a dreadful despotism by any standards. And yet one of the reasons we are told that we must support the Bahraini government, and I've been told this by serving ambassadors currently, by senior people I know inside the Foreign Office, they say to me that we have to support the regime in Bahrain because otherwise Bahrain will fall under Iranian influence. Just as 50 years ago, it was interesting to say, they were saying it'll be Egyptian influence. Was actually what we would like to see is Bahrain under Bahraini influence. That would be a very pleasant change. And yet, Iran, and I am no fan of the regime in Iran. I think there are many human rights problems in Iran, but it is certainly more democratic than Bahrain. So if democracy were the ultimate aim, then British policy is not consistent, not consistent at all. But one of the strange things is it's not even consistent in terms of the realpolitik, because the other thing which goes along with the Iranian narrative, which I'm told by senior people within the Foreign Office, is that we have to support the monarchy because otherwise the country will be controlled by the Shia population. And that's given as a reason to support the monarchy. And yet, we have just fought a war killed hundreds of thousands of people in order to install a Shia government in Iraq. So again, where is the consistency between those two analyses? Why one particular strand of Muslim belief should be more inimical to the UK than another is something for which, frankly, there's not a great deal of logical argument. But it is one of the many arguments that are put forward within the FCO to justify their current policy. As I see it, and having seen policy from the inside for the 20 years I was in the FCO, in effect, we have a policy for the Middle East, which really centres around the twin poles of Saudi Arabia and Israel, and supporting those governments. And the rest of Middle Eastern policy is seen through that sphere. And Bahrain is viewed within the Foreign Office as really a subset of the need to keep the Saudi regime in power. And that, I think, is the cause of a huge amount of mischief in British foreign policy, the cause of a huge amount of mischief in the world, and poisons the British body politic. And one of the worst things I've seen in British government, perhaps the most corrupt thing I've seen in British government in my lifetime, was the decision, for example, to drop the prosecution of BAE because it would affect the Saudi royal family. So the heart of British foreign policy in this area is immoral and it's corrupt, and they really, really don't care about human rights at all. Extraordinary rendition and torture. It's not just through freelancers like Henderson. MI6 and the CIA have been involved actively in complicity in torture for decades. And that isn't stopping either. 1 minute. Coming to the question of why people do it, the answer is, of course, individuals get money. One of the people who's now the legal, John Yates, big money. David Bethlehem, legal advisor to the government of Bahrain, former Foreign Office legal advisor. He's the guy who advised the Israeli government that the wall across the West Bank is legal. He went on to become the Foreign Office legal advisor because when all the Foreign Office's 20 internal legal advisors said the war in Iraq was illegal, he was prepared to say it was legal. So he got that job. He advised the government that it would be illegal to give the court the details of the torture of Binyam Mohammed. And now he's retired from the Foreign Office and he's gone off to advise the government of Bahrain. And he has made a fortune from the government of Israel, from the government of the UK, from the government of Bahrain, by supporting repression and being on the side of the oppressor and against the victim. And we have this combination of an immoral and uncaring British foreign policy centred on support for Saudi Arabia and Israel, and we have the ambition of individual members of the establishment who see big bucks coming to them personally, and it's a vicious and poisonous combination, and I'm afraid that's what we're up against.
Thank you. Rita, I'm going to come to you next, if you can. No problem. Now, I know you're going to talk about other things as well, but can you from a British perspective, and with particularly Ibrahim, how have you found any support from the British Foreign Office, or have you been working with them? What's your connection been like with Britain at all, from a foreign perspective, and in assistance that they may be able to provide you?
Well, actually, when we talk to the officials in the British Embassy in Bahrain, they talk about their sympathetic views, with Ibrahim and the other prisoners of conscience. And also when we read the statements of these, British people in very high political positions. But then on the ground, we find, as gentleman before me talked, it's exactly what he described. we find that there is the morals and the values disappear, and it's the interests that is playing the major role, and it's business as usual, and it's the maintenance of the status quo. So we always say that you have to walk your talk. All this talk about true constitutional democracy, monarchy, I mean, with all these beautiful democratic ideas, we feel that you are the greatest partner with the regime, and you know all the details. You have the ruler to measure what is wrong and how wrong it is. But then we find business is going as usual, because money is a big corrupter. And Mr. Yates, when he came, he talks about good practices, best practices, but we find the worst practices are still going on. We find torture going on, and there is an encouragement of this culture of impunity for all these people in power. The accountability issue, which is number one towards any national reconciliation, this has been frozen, and they are happy with a few police officers going to jail for 7 years, and they have not said a word about these 100 martyrs who have been killed in very ugly ways from very close ranges. And also another thing, the judiciary system in Bahrain. All these trials, the military trials and the civil trials in both kinds of courts, they don't differ a bit. In the case of the 13 prisoners of conscience, after all these months and after all these torture testimonies that everybody knows about, and after the cassation won beautiful verdict that said that these people are innocent and they have done they just spoke their minds about the way they wanted Bahrain to be. The final cassation court verdict came to reiterate and say exactly what the military court said. So if we are talking about best practices, if we are talking about justice, you know all of that in Bahrain, and you have done nothing. So we are asking the British government to really look at its principles and do that balance, because Bahrain has changed. Mr. Shamlan said the truth. The condition of Bahrain is still the same. Bahrain is not related to any foreign agenda. The agenda of these national demands are purely Bahraini. They have been there since the 20s, the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 90s. And the people of Bahrain will continue their struggle, because these are just causes. And, the people cannot go back. Since February 14th, people have sacrificed with everything. They have sacrificed their lives. They are willing to go forward because they deserve democracy, and it is, their deserved rights.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Anna, can I ask you, when you're talking to, also, if you can try and answer this question, what do you think, or what do you say that Britain should be doing that they're not doing already?
I've been in the UK for a couple of months, having lived in Bahrain for a few years, and I thought I could, I'd begin as an activist by engaging with the British government. And I think as the opposition, not speaking in the name of the opposition or anything, but from the general position of someone who's trying to help in this particular cause of obtaining democracy in Bahrain, I kind of decided to do as much as I could to engage with British officials and so on. And our point has been, we're not asking for intervention here. We're not saying, look, send your tanks and guns and get rid of, remove the head of the royal family in Bahrain, like the same calls that we're hearing around Syria. We're saying stop supporting a dictator in Bahrain. We're saying you are providing the legitimacy to the ruling family. You're conferring legitimacy that you've been providing cost-free for the past 100 years. And Bahrainis have cyclically been rising up quite bravely over every decade to ask the British that stop supporting this ruling family. Now, so we're not asking them to intervene and save us, and we're not asking for kind of extra the imperial power to come and save us as, you know, as being powerless. No, we're saying we are actually powerful enough to defeat and achieve our own demands, but you're standing in our way. You, as foreign powers, the UK and the US, you're standing in the way because you're supporting this government. Now, for me, the most symbolic step taken was obviously the invasion of Saudi troops into Bahrain. Now, there was a point where you believed, if you were on the ground, if you were at the Pearl Roundabout, where you were seeing marches onto the royal palaces, on the royal court, there was a moment where people thought the royal family would collapse and would finally be defeated. And this was a culmination of where we saw at least a quarter of the citizenry take to the streets to just brutally crush the possibility of that even happening. And I remember standing there outside the royal palace in Safriya at the door, almost knocking on the door, saying, I wonder why no one's breaking this door down. Okay, we're only kind of one. I know there were police on the other side and the army was on the other side, but we were this close, right? And it felt like we were this close. So to have seen an entire foreign army cross the bridge and enter to save the royal family, that was when you felt that you were not fighting just the royal family in Bahrain. You were fighting the rest of the world here, because everyone was behind and backing that particular intervention. So while we saw an intervention in Libya to get rid of Gaddafi, we saw a different kind of intervention in Bahrain, and that was really the hypocrisy in that was quite kind of very disappointing and made our dreams, kind of really crushed our dreams at that particular point in time. But then what was amazing was after 3 months of martial law, in which there was a complete crackdown, there was a complete lockdown of the country, mass arrests. I think she got the knock on her door. You know, my husband was picked up on his way back from work. Everyone has a story to tell. There's people sitting here in the audience today who've spent time in prison, who've had that knock on the door. And I'm being kind of very euphemistic here when I say a knock on the door. We're talking about dawn raids, police, masked police, and you can imagine the rest. So everyone has a story to tell, a personal story to tell, which is very difficult. And just today, I mean, we're talking about a small island that's about 250 square kilometers. It takes you less than an hour to cross the island. It has a population, it's about the size of Malta. It has a population of about 1 million. It's a very close community. Everyone knows each other almost on a, you know, there's 1 or 2 degrees of separation. So the 17-year-old boy whose picture's hanging here, who was killed today from the village of Deh, you know, we would all be at his funeral tomorrow if we were in Bahrain. We're very kind of a very close community. So I remember talking to the head of the Human Rights Inquiry when he was saying, when he investigated Bosnia, on average, every person that was killed in the genocide would have maybe 3 or 4 relatives. In Bahrain, there'd be a family of 200. So when we say 100 people have been killed, we're saying that the collective consciousness has felt the pain of someone being killed in their family. So it makes the passions extremely strong, and we're seeing that in the anniversary today. I didn't know what would happen in Bahrain today. I thought, you know, maybe they finally did. The narrative is the Bahraini revolution has been crushed. It was quelled. It ended when the Saudis came in. Today, I think, was proof that that was indeed not the case. We've seen passions extremely, you know, running really high. And last year, it was Nabeel Rajab, who's one of the most popular human rights activists in Bahrain. He has around 200,000 followers on Twitter. He would lead a one-man protest, and then everyone else would follow. And walk to the Pearl Roundabout, which was crushed and destroyed. I mean, I don't know which other government in the history has destroyed its own national monument to prove a point, to say that we don't just crush your dreams, we also crush your symbols and your icons, your physical symbols and icons. So we saw the Pearl Monument, which was insignificant before the uprising, suddenly being bulldozed completely over in this territorial, narrow-minded vision of sovereignty here. So the monument was crushed. It's turned into a military barracks. So on the 14th of February every year, people feel that the banner that they carry is their right to return to that particular location, where they stayed for 1 month and camped out for 1 month. It's a symbolic place where they felt liberated and they want to return one day. So as long as that place continues to be locked down, that's a sign that the crisis is still ongoing. Now, Nabeel Rajab, for example, last year took his daughter and his wife and he walked to the Pearl Roundabout, gets arrested, gets thrown in jail. He gets sentenced to 3 years in prison. But he was really he turned into a revolution. He was more than a human rights activist. He turned into a revolutionary protest leader. And that was a red line for the government and I think for his foreign supporters, that you don't cross that line. You do not call for the overthrow of the monarchy here. You'll get thrown in jail like everyone else. Now, I thought there's no Nabeel Rajab anymore in Bahrain. Who is going to be leading the movement this year? I mean, has everyone lost hope now? You know, everyone who raises the flag and the banner gets thrown into. There's no one around. But what we saw is that maybe there were, I think, in my estimate, there were at least 30 to 40 protests across the country in each village facing the police. And the fact that there's a death means that they were running their police quite thin and they were out of control and someone was going to die and someone would pay with their price for taking to the streets. And that's indeed what we saw happening today. So again, there are just a quick, 3 quick points, is that this is a historical, Bahrain's struggle for liberation and democracy is a long-standing historical struggle. That the international legitimacy that's conferred by the US and the UK is what's stopping us from achieving our democratic demands. And the way that they confer that legitimacy is by spending millions on PR companies, which we've been documenting in Bahrain Watch. We know of at least 18 to 20 PR companies that are working for the Bahraini government, and they're there really to control the narrative that protesters are violent, that they're hooligans, they're rioters, basically the Orientalist type of, barbaric indigenous citizens, and that this is backed by the Iranian government, and just to delegitimize it. So they spend millions trying to propagate that sectarian narrative. And ask anyone who's tried to cover Bahrain. I had immense trouble trying to find a journalist to speak on the panel today because any journalist who wants to cover Bahrain needs a visa and the government will not give a visa. So we've also been documenting access problems to Bahrain. There's been over 230 journalists over the last 2 years who've been denied entry. Just simply either deported, not given visas, not being allowed to enter Bahrain at all to cover the events. So we haven't had a foreign media outlet present in the country permanently to cover what goes on. And at the same time, local activists and local journalists are harassed constantly and jailed for reporting on the situation. And then we have these cosmetic reforms that are designed to just allow foreign allies a chance to propagate the pretense that there's reform. So you've seen David Cameron say they're reforming. This is different from Syria because the government's reforming. So they will throw something that looks like a dialogue or some kind of negotiation process when in fact it's devoid of any kind of sincerity, and Bahrainians again get disappointed because it doesn't deliver on any of its promises.
Thank you. Alice sent me an email. She said, make sure you stick to the times.
That's all right.
Okay, well, finally, Mike, I wonder if you were there.
Absolutely, yeah.
You're also, you're a British national, but you were also a British national. You were living there. From a British perspective, I wonder if you could tell us what you see, but also your thoughts about British government involvement in Bahrain.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I was a resident in Bahrain from August 2007 until March 2011. So I was an eyewitness not only to the uprising itself, but also to the few years preceding that. Originally, I was a professor of comparative literature at the University of Bahrain. Prior to that, I'd worked in the United Arab Emirates for 5 years, and before that, I'd worked and studied in Egypt, so I have reasonable Arab world experience. In late 2008, I was asked to play a leadership role in the start-up of Bahrain Teachers College, which was one of two brand new higher education institutions, the other being Bahrain Polytechnic, which were established under the aegis of the EDB, the Economic Development Board, to implement a series of reforms, ultimately reporting to the Crown Prince of Bahrain, Salman Khalifa, who, as you probably know, is the regime's, supposed to be the regime's leading reform advocate. In the course of my work there, I would work closely with a range of international higher education institutions. These would involve working with consultants from the Institute of Education, University of London, York St John's University, the UK Higher Education Academy, of which I'm a fellow, which is the UK's lead body in ensuring excellence in teaching and learning in higher education in the UK, and a variety of other international consultants, the National Institute of Education Singapore, and whatnot. I would also work very closely, and I've worked with Ustadha Farida here very closely at the Ministry of Education, trying to implement reform. So I was very interested to see David Cameron saying that Bahrain is different to Syria and everywhere else because Bahrain is, unlike those places, is dedicated to reform. So apparently is Saudi Arabia. And I'm in the interesting position of being a British person who's worked in higher education, in reform, in Bahrain for a good deal longer than David Cameron has been Prime Minister. What I would say is I had to flee there on the 21st of March 2011. 2 days before that, I'd been threatened by a nervous Saudi soldier pointing an American automatic rifle at my head. 2 days before that, I received a number of abusive and threatening phone calls telling me to shut up. One of which my wife Miranda, who's good at this sort of thing, was able to trace to the Ministry of the Interior. They had the kindness to phone me up at 3:30 in the morning and tell me that I needed to be careful. Why were they doing that? Well, for a number of reasons. I'd always been a kind of nail that hadn't been knocked down there. But largely because of what I witnessed on the 13th of March 2011, 4 days before the Saudi invasion. We have to be clear here that were it not for external intervention, initially Saudi military intervention, and following that the strong political support which Alistair Burt and the FCO is lending to the Bahrain regime, were it simply an internal Bahraini affair, the Khalifa regime would have been, what would it have been, the third Arab world dictatorship. I make no distinction between monarchies and republics in this regard. The third Arab dictatorship to fall following Egypt. Tunisia, Egypt, the next one would have been Bahrain. What did I see on the 13th of March? I saw I arrived at work at about 8:30. By 9, a smallish demonstration, a few hundred, mainly female undergraduate students, about, well, they would have been what, sort of 18, 19, 20 years old, had started a pro-democracy demonstration. Very, very quickly, this was attacked by a gang who had turned up armed for the purpose with a variety of implements, which included swords, spears, iron bars, all the kind of things that you wouldn't expect people to take into a university, and started laying into the demonstration. This mob was then backed up by the quote-unquote police, for whom disgraced former policeman John Yates works in Ian Henderson's former role. Some of the young ladies who were being attacked, the young men, linked arms around them to make a human chain to protect them, sustaining quite serious blows to the head, and not unsurprisingly, they called in their bigger older, and I dare say uglier, perhaps, relatives from the villages, basically to come and defend them. What happened then was a melee from which, frankly, I was lucky to escape, if not with my life, certainly in one piece, and certainly not without being arrested. Previous to that, working with the International Higher Education and Consultants, I'd taken my job seriously. I want a glass of water, actually, but I really think after seeing all these expats at the British Club and the Dillman Club and whatever, all these places I know very well, and I really feel like I should have a G&T or something. You talk terribly like this. Because, thank you, because as long as you're on side, you do lead a gilded life. You know, you do have a very generous figure salary. Your kids are paid to go to private school. I used to drive around in a Range Rover and all that. Take that, criticise the regime as a British person, criticise the regime, and that's taken away from you viciously. Last time I checked, and I've not yet put this to the test, last time I checked, I was on an arrest list were I to set foot in Bahrain again. So is my wife, Miranda, over there. So is my 4-year-old daughter, who was born in Jidhaf's maternity hospital, a public sector maternity hospital in Bahrain. If she wouldn't be arrested, she'd certainly be turned away at the airport because, sweet little girl that she is, she's nonetheless a pro-Iranian subversive. I have some problems placing her in a primary school with a background like that. But yeah. Joking aside, David Cameron said that Bahrain is not Syria. No, true. It's not Syria. It's not as violent as Syria. But I think we need to get, our head around a few things. I personally saw, and if I never see the like of such again, I will consider this to be the greatest honour in my life. I was an eyewitness to a popular revolution with about 1/3 of the population on the street. These were the biggest ever demonstrations as a percentage of population of the entire Arab Spring, including Egypt, quite possibly the largest demonstrations ever in the Arab world, including the big public funeral for Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. Bahrain, about 100 people around, depending on who you listen, around about 100. There's been around about 100 martyrs. It doesn't sound a lot in the scheme of things. Bahrain has an indigenous population of about 600,000. I say indigenous because the expatriate population, which is the other half of the population, is more inconvenienced by what's going on than suffers from it. So I think we have to look at it as a percentage of the indigenous population. So Bahrain has an indigenous population of 600,000. Britain has a population of about 60 million. If you read the Daily Mail, there's a bit more. So to get an understanding of what that would mean from a British perspective, bung a couple of noughts on the end, it's the equivalent of an uprising in Britain, which would have cost 10,000 lives in the course of 2 years. It makes it a lot more lethal and a lot more bloody than Northern Ireland. I rest my case. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we go out, and I'm going to ask people to make contributions and specifically ask questions, I just also want to tell you about this book here that's at the front. I encourage all of you to have a look at it and spend your money and buy it. It only costs £20. It's a very good book. Right. Okay, do we have a mic? Yes. We do have a mic. All right. What I'm going to do, I'm going to take one at a time. I'm not going to ask for groups of 3, but I'm going to ask you to keep it short. So, first of all, you had your hand up first.
Former MP Jawad Firouz, I think maybe some of you know that recently they revoked my nationality just because I want to express my duty to defend the peoples. See, let us see a short comparison. The Western values and principles and the political system based on the democracy, human rights, and meantime to protect their interest in the Middle East in general. I think this is obvious. So let us make a short comparison between the two. the current regime and the opposition. Which one of them are more close to these principles in general? Current regime, as everyone knows, a non-democratic dictatorship. They apply totally against the human rights, and they are practicing it regardless of the promises they given to the international media or international committee and so on, and discrimination is there in everything. So if you go along, they are totally against all the principles of the Western values. In comparison, the opposition, clearly they want a democratic state, a civil democratic state. They don't want to be a religious state, and they don't want to be a sectarian state. Totally, they want to be democratic based on the following: elected government, one man, one vote, totally elected and full authority for the representative council, and so on. How we can believe now more than 50% of the population are not allowed to serve in the military? Shia are not allowed to serve in the military at all. And they are not allowed to serve in any security or Ministry of Interior. How is it? So at the end, I can say the interest of the West is with the opposition. Opposition who want a peaceful process to lead to the total serious reform, leading to a unity within Bahrain, and as you said here, the Bahrain to be just for Bahrainis, nothing to do with Iran or Saudi. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution. Are there any questions? You might want to come back at the end if we can. Are there any questions? You have a question? Yes.
Qasim Al-Hashmi, head of Bahrain International Mission. Considering saying that Cameron has said Bahrain is different than Syria, and the Minister of Foreign for American, United States Foreign, advising Syrians not to throw their guns, their weapons. Do we understand that the Europeans and Americans are taking Syria as an example, and they wanted to push us in Bahrain to carry our gun, and so they will interfere, or what is the case exactly? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Greg, if I may, I'm going to ask you to address probably that question. Comparison with Syria by David Cameron. Is it an attempt to encourage the revolution in Bahrain, or what?
I think it's a simple piece of hypocrisy. I mean, I understand it's a rhetorical question, and you're making a claim that that if the importance of a struggle for freedom is measured in deaths and casualties, then that's not a very good example to set, and I would agree with that. But I'd like to say also in relation to the last comment that I think sadly, it's undoubtedly true that the Bahraini opposition is much closer to Western values than the Bahraini government is. But sadly, Western values, or so-called Western values, aren't actually what rules Western countries. What rules Western countries are the economic interests of a very small elite. And those economic interests of a small elite are linked to the economic interests of an elite with which they are comfortable in Bahrain. And that, sadly, is what it's all about. It's nothing to do with democracy, nothing to do with human rights, and nothing to do with so-called Western values, which are a smokescreen for which Western governments don't really care at all.
Yeah, of course you can.
I understand that the gentleman is a pro-government supporter to a certain extent, and I think that we also, although most of us work in human rights and in trying to encourage democracy in Bahrain, I think we also have to have a certain amount of sympathy for people who are supporters of the regime for whatever reason, because they're part of Bahrain as well. And I think that in any country we have to have a certain amount of sympathy for the legitimate fears that some of those people have, if the country were to change, because and I don't want to stress the comparison with Northern Ireland too much, but you have to understand both parties who are involved in the crisis, if you're going to try and reach a situation which is acceptable to everybody. There's got to be reconciliation where both sides, or all sides in Bahrain, because there are a number of different parties that we're talking about, where everybody feels that they haven't given up too much, but they've got some of what they want. So it is important, to have some sympathy with the fears of other parties involved in the situation in Bahrain, whether we agree with them or not.
Thank you, John. You had your hand up? Yes. Thank you.
My name is Jessie Harrington. I do apologize. I don't know about the matters that go on in Bahrain, so I came here just to learn a bit more. I just wanted to ask, what is like the least the opposition would accept, and like what would they do? That is, it's like what would be the compromise point of the opposition in Bahrain, and what sort of things do you want? What would be, let's say, the least, and then what can be done to allay the fears of the other side?
Can I ask you to? Oh, you'll probably be the best person to.
Yes, I think the negotiations will decide, the points that will be, an agreement between both sides. But I think.
What is non-negotiable, for example?
The points that the opposition have carefully put, and for a long time have thought about very carefully, is that, first of all, we want negotiation, not dialogue, because we have been going through past experiences of dialogue. Dialogue meant just exchanging ideas, exchanging talks, and then nothing happens. So these are undone promises. We are talking about negotiations now. This is the first point. Second point is that the regime is a main partner in this, because they were talking about they would be administering all that, trying to convey the conflict between the opposition and the pro-government societies. This is not the case. It's a political regime that has to change to be democratic. And so this is the second point. It's very reasonable. We talk about a real constitutional monarchy that will go by this principle. The people are the source of all powers. This is Article number 1 in the Constitution. Al-Sha'b masdar sulatat jami'an. This very simple idea must be applied or implemented in any true democratic constitutional monarchy. We have the National Charter that said you will be promised, after this, the Constitution of 2002 was given by the King. It was only, it was introduced by the King, and it was not done in agreement with the people. This is the big, this is the main flaw that we are talking about as Bahrainis. So we were promised to have an experience, an experiment like the deep-rooted democracies. So people of Bahrain are worthy of that. They want to see that happen, and it's their legitimate right. On the agenda, the opposition has, an elected government, like the UK. Why not? Aren't the Bahraini people worthy of an elected government? This is very simple, and it's acceptable in all, democracies. We are talking about an electoral system, a fair electoral system, because our system now, the discrepancy between numbers and the constituencies is very big, because it's been gerrymandered. It's been designed to give certain, proportions between Sunnis and Shias, and we refuse that. We ask for security for all. It's unacceptable that many of the security bodies that are responsible for the security of everybody to be shot and not be accepting Shias. Shias are citizens. We are talking about equal citizenship. So they have to be let into these, security bodies. We talk about stopping political naturalization. It's immoral to bring thousands of people illegally, to put them into the system, and then talk about law and state of law and order. You can't lie forever. We are talking about fighting discrimination. We are talking about implementing the BICI recommendations, the United Nations recommendations. These are the points on the agenda. We are asking to fighting corruption. We are asking for transitional justice. So these are the points that the opposition are demanding and defending. And it's, of course, it's for the talks to see what can be agreed upon.
Thank you very much. Do you want to come in very briefly?
Yeah, very briefly. A lot of this is public record. It's online. If you look at the main political societies in Bahrain, we don't have parties, they're called societies, the main opposition parties, and what I would describe as the moderate pro-regime elements. One put forward a 5-point set of proposals, the other a 7-point. There's actually quite a lot of commonality between them. I mean, it really isn't rocket science to get some kind of reconciliation between those two sides. I think the problem is that when people talk about the Bahrain government or the Bahrain regime, blah, 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 really, though, you're dealing with shifting loci of power. And although there may be people within the ruling family who might well make the necessary compromises, you have other equally powerful people who I would argue, like the Prime Minister, who I would argue is the real ruler of Bahrain on behalf of Saudi Arabia and Britain, working, and his supporters working to undermine it. So it's a very complex situation.
Thank you very much. Is it going to be a question? Cool. Excellent. Can we have the...
The quick question is, however, before that, I'll just take 30 seconds.
Ah,
Mr.
yeah.
Mr. Yates. No, I wanted to make a joke, you see,
Okay,
that's why, so everyone can enjoy it. When
We are all under the age of 61.
When Mr. Yates talks about sort of best practices, perhaps he's talking about refinement of torture to the ultimate best practice. So that's what he's perhaps referring. My question is, one always talks about dialogue, negotiations, and sort of sitting down with the regime as such. Is it realistic when the British government has a policy that one does not negotiate with terrorists? Does one negotiate with tyrants?
That would be the end of our foreign policy if that was the case. Does anybody want to come back very quickly on that? Should we take a couple of questions?
Questions about differences of opinion in the royal family and the ministers. Can you touch on the differences of opinion, repression versus conciliation? Who holds which opinion? You've just touched on this subject with respect to the Prime Minister. I want to focus on this. It's quite important with getting any movement in the present position. So, does anyone feel qualified to comment?
Who's best to come back on that? Anna, go on.
On the 2 points, do we negotiate with tyrants? Good point. And you almost wish that the dialogue that's currently been promoted over the last week is actually with the tyrant. Actually, it's not a dialogue between the opposition and the government. It's a dialogue between a small group of the opposition with other groups that represent other people. Well, that's why I said it's a small group of the opposition. It's not all of the opposition. So it's not a dialogue actually with the people who are the decision makers in the country, which are at least the top echelon of those in power, which would be the king, the prime minister, or the crown prince. This is just kind of like a talking shop, and that's what most people don't believe it's sincere in its promise of delivering any kind of democratic.
I just add to that one of the representatives, Hussein, the guy from the embassy, told me yesterday when I said to him, why isn't the Crown Prince leading the dialogue? Because the opposition have some faith in the ability of the Crown Prince to generate some sort of progress. He said to me, well, the loyalists don't really like the Crown Prince, so we have to put his deputy in, the Justice Minister, instead, because he's more acceptable to the loyalists. So I said, well, okay, I understand, but what you're saying is you care more about what the loyalists think than what the opposition thinks. but you're not really having this. You shouldn't be having this discussion with the people who agree with you. You should be having this discussion with the people who don't agree with you.
Can I just come in very briefly?
Very briefly.
Yeah. The thing with the Crown Prince, the reform project of which I was a small part, went off the rails in about early 2010, where the Crown Prince seemed to have lost out in an internal palace coup to hardline elements, and that forms a large part of the background of what happened in February, or 2 years ago. It isn't simply mimetic things. People do this in Egypt, and people in Bahrain say, hey, let's do that ourselves. There was an immediate political crisis going back from most of the previous year, which links to the earlier crises we've seen here.
Okay.
Can I just...
Sorry, you hadn't finished.
I hadn't finished, but it's this man's question about where the loci of power lie in the royal family. Something like that, was it?
Power, but also opinion, differences in opinion.
Differences in opinion, yeah.
Opinion will have deadlock rather than unanimity. If you've got a tyrant, you've got unanimity, you can negotiate with them, get hold of the problem. If you haven't got that, you can't get through it. So that's the important thing, is to tease out who holds which opinion, and then you can start work that way.
Yeah, well, there is this narrative, I think, that it's almost like an accepted belief that we have reformers and hardliners within the royal family, and that some people kind of, but my view very simply is that there's a good cop, there's a bad cop, but there's an internal power struggle and a generational struggle within the royal family and within the opposition. Okay, so you have a new generation, youth within the royal family, youth within the opposition, do things differently, see things in a different way. Doesn't necessarily mean that the Crown Prince is a genuine reformer. We haven't seen those genuine reforms materially appear anywhere, either in the economic system to which he assumes power and control over the kind of economic reforms that haven't been delivered, and actually those have been shelved completely, or the hardliners, apparently the head of the army and the prime minister are the ones that are in total power. Those ropes, who's holding the ropes? Is from the outside, it's a closed almost box. They're closed even from their own loyalists. So, but we kind of, in our understanding and in the discourse that we use, is we assume that one's a reformer and one's a hardliner, and that there's a good cop, bad cop. But in reality, I think there's a power struggle. He didn't like the way his uncle goes about his business. He has been in power for 42 years. This is the longest-serving prime minister. He's unquestionably a red line, even though the opposition has been calling for him for an elected prime minister. He wants to sit on the throne, till death. And then there's this power struggle where the younger ones in the royal family, and you speak, and I've met a few of them and stuff. They say that we try to change things, but not for the benefit of the people, but at least to get some things done, to get things moving. I mean, I could give you stories if you want from what I've heard from within those circles, but it doesn't give me hope as someone who's fighting for change to say, well, please put the Crown Prince on the table with us, because maybe he wasn't holding the ropes of power. They were negotiating with the wrong person during the Pearl Roundabout days. So even if he came back, who knows? If he doesn't hold the ropes, he's not the right person to negotiate with, if you do believe that there should be a negotiated settlement. There are parts, one final thing. Okay. There are parts of the opposition who believe that that you shouldn't be sitting on the table with the royal family in the first place, that these rights are non-negotiable. They're rights that are in the ICCPR, they're rights that are universal, that you ask for an elected government. It's not something that we can sit there saying, well, do we have half a democracy, 20% democracy? We're not quite ready for 75% democracy. It doesn't work that way. Like, you either have some kind of full democracy, or you don't have democracy at all. It doesn't come in, as Shamlan said, in the 50s, you don't get these reforms in installments, you get them as a whole package. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I just want to try and bring some more people in. Can I ask the lady with the glasses? That's you. And then the gentleman at the back with the beard. And then after that, we'll take one final person. You've been having your hand up all the way through, so you can be the final person.
I'd like to know how the opposition, I know it's not a monolith, but different people in the opposition want or think they should deal with Saudi Arabia, because the way I understand it, it's Saudi Arabia really that is in control, or what it wants drives a lot of what happens. And so I just would like some thoughts on what could happen with Saudi Arabia. Is it possible to negotiate with them, given that the royal family is so close to with Saudi Arabia.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to respond very quickly to that point, if you can, and Farida also.
I'll leave that to you.
Leave it to Farida.
We want Bahrain to be managing its own business, to be really independent, as they always talk about Iran's, supposed role. We want Bahrain to mind its own business and be free of this Saudi big brother hand all the time. We like Saudis. We love Saudis. We love Kuwaitis, Qataris. We want them to visit us, but as ordinary citizens, but not as conquerors and not as controllers. The Bahraini people have always welcomed the unification of the Arabian Gulf states, but on the principles of respecting human rights and giving people their rights and political participation. So it should be a unification among the people of all these countries for the right purposes, not for the security of these monarchies and for keeping them in their position.
Thank you, Farida.
Shortly.
So I'm going to ask you both together, actually, if I may. Is it a question, sir?
Yes, it's partially a question and partially a point.
Okay. We keep it very brief, sir. Sorry.
The point is that, the feeling is that I don't want to see another Arab country wrecked by uprisings that are ruthlessly put down. Where we've seen this happening in the countries that Britain, America, and Israel are fond of, like Israel itself, the people are being repressed, and we're not supporting them, and it's very tragic. Where we've been on the side of the rebels, as in the case of Libya and Syria, it's even worse, because the whole country's being wrecked, and everybody's suffering as a result. I just wondered whether you have a plan, as the lady in the front asked, that's going to deal with the huge American pressure from their interests there to stop the country getting wrecked due to the suppression of the inevitable uprising.
Thank you very much for your contribution. Before we go to answer that question, I wonder if we can just come to you and maybe your final.
I'm Jalal Firooza. I'm also a former MP in Bahrain Parliament. Just need to raise this issue with the gentleman who was an ex-ambassador. I'm sorry.
Craig Murray.
Yeah, Craig Murray. Sorry for forgetting your name. For what reason do you think the British government will not think that the long-term interest of the British people and the British economy will be in a stable Bahrain, even though the Bahraini opposition will be either part or even fully in control of the government, when you see that on the other side will be more eruption for the 2 years of repression and crackdown, more problems happened. And I agree with the gentleman before me. If you don't come into this issue of understanding the people's requests, then you will have another Libya or Syria or whatever. Even though you can see the people of Bahrain, how peaceful and how enlightened they are. I'm talking about the opposition, and they are refusing any violence at all. So why don't you think that on the long term it will be for the British people to support the opposition? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Craig Murray, I wonder if you can come back on both points, actually.
Yeah, well, I think the British government's calculation is that the regime can survive, and can survive for decades, and that reform and change is not inevitable. They calculate that the current situation serves them very well. It keeps Saudi very happy, keeps the Americans happy. They have the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, and it keeps a significant part of the British establishment, which has commercial and personal ties to the Bahraini ruling elite. It keeps them happy too. So they think they have got everything they want from the status quo, and they believe. We've seen And the sad thing is, this often turns out to be truer than you would wish. We've seen that from the video that for over 50 years the people of Bahrain have been struggling for freedom and have not obtained it. And the British government thinks as long as there is no reform, as long as harsh repression is maintained, as long as the leaders kept on, that it can last for another 50 years. And British diplomats tend to be very well read. One thing which is very current is, of course, the theory of Alexis de Tocqueville, the great 19th century French historian, who said the moment of maximum danger for any regime is when it starts to reform. And that's a philosophy which is much understood in the British Foreign Office, and their philosophy is that regimes should not start to reform because otherwise they will be in danger. And I saw this where I was in Uzbekistan. I argued exactly the same. I said there's a dictatorship here which is hated, there's great pressure building up against the regime, we're seen to support the regime, one day there'll be an explosion, and the worrying thing is that the Uzbek people will hate us because they supported the regime. And what the British government said to me was, don't worry, the regime can survive for decades, we can keep the lid on. And I actually didn't believe them. And I believed there would be a revolution in Uzbekistan before now, and there hasn't been. And the sad thing is, in this harsh world of realpolitik, if you don't actually care about rights, don't care about reform, and don't care about anything except money, you can keep the lid on with vicious torture, repression, foreign armies. You can do it. What we have to encourage is a great swelling of resistance to that philosophy, both in Bahrain and in the UK, and which partly, I think, is the answer to the first question as well, that is there a nice, simple, straightforward, negotiated solution to all this where everything ends up peacefully and there's very little damage in the country? And my feeling is that, sadly, there are very few examples in history of truly brutal dictatorial regimes giving up power gracefully. It just doesn't tend to happen. So I do think, and I'm very, very sad about it, we are going to see more horror and more disaster before we see the light.
Well, there you go. That's a note to end on, isn't it? Well, thank you very much for coming along this evening. I hope you found it informative. I know that many of you in the audience are already are obviously very experienced and understand what's going on. The theme of this evening's talk was about British involvement, and although we also, obviously many people wanted to talk about what was going on in Bahrain, I hope you took something away about about Britain's foreign policy, and particularly in relation to the short film about our involvement within Bahrain. Like any foreign policy, British foreign policy is about, well, what's best for Britain. And it's not really that complex when it comes to anything. That is the simple question that I think most foreign secretaries ask themselves. And so it is not surprising when we have an extensive amount of financial contracts and sport and defence manufacturing going on with the countries to which we seem to close up to and be shoulder to shoulder with, that it's not surprising that when the people of Bahrain rose up and looked at Britain for their help, that it wasn't really that forthcoming, because there was a financial need more than probably any other need when it came to Great Britain, and maybe that's the reason why in the end it took the path that eventually it did choose, sadly leaving many within Bahrain without the support that they really desperately needed. Well, there you are. It comes really to thank our great speakers that we've had this evening in the usual way by